Another possible way we can avoid duplicate records in our database table is to simply query our database table and see if the record is already there. And if the record is there, we can return back an error message saying that the record already exists. So if I look at the user entity object, we have defined a unique field, which is email address. So what we can do, we can query our database table for email address, and then if such email address is already in the database, we'll return an error message. So I'll return this unique attribute from column, and I will go back to my user service implementation and open user repository, because this is the class that we use to query database table. So I'll hold Command key and click on Open Declaration, and this is our user repository class that extends CRUD repository. And remember that CRUD repository provides us with a ready-to-use methods that allow us to save, update, and delete records in the database. But additionally to those ready-to-use provided methods, we can define our own custom methods that will also be able to query database. So let's define one. The return value of this method will be user entity. We want to query database table for a user, and if user record is found, we want to return user entity. Now, Spring Data GPA provides us with a very convenient and easy to use query language. And this is about the way you name your functions. For example, if you're defining a method that needs to query database table, for example, you need to find a record, then for those methods that need to find a record in the database, you start those methods with the keyword find. And the next part of the method is you're looking for a record by what field. We're going to look for a method by email, so I'm going to continue with by. And this is very important that we use by. We cannot skip it. So find by, and then if I look at the user entity, we're looking by email. So I need to provide email. If I provide encrypted password or last name, for example, then I'm going to look by a last name. But if I'm looking by email, then in my method, I need to provide email. And then I need to provide a value of that email address. And that value will be sent to our method as a method argument. So I'm defining an argument here by email, and this is it. So this is the rule. If we want to query database table, and database table is defined inside of the user entity, so if we go into our user entity, this is the database table. So it's going to query database that has a name users, and it will find a record by email, and then it will return it as a user entity. So now we will save this and we will go back to our user service implementation. And what we're going to do here, before saving data in our database, we will first check if this record is there or not, if a record with provided email address exists or not. And if it exists, we will throw an exception. And I will do it actually at the very top of this method, and I will define a user entity, and I will call it stored user details equals, and then I will use user repository, and I will use the method that we have just created, find by, and here it is, find by email, and I will provide the email address which I can read from user DTO get email. And now I can check if stored user details not equal to null, then I know that the user exists. So I will use if statement, and then I will say if stored user details not equals null, then I will throw an exception. And again, I do not want to go into exception handling techniques now. I will simply throw a runtime exception, but when we talk about how to handle exception, we will define a custom exception that will extend runtime exception, and we might call that exception user service exception, which will be thrown by throw new user service exception. But at this moment, we will simply throw a runtime exception, and we will give it a custom message, something like record already exists. And I actually see that we already have stored user details. So I will simplify this. I will copy this line of code. I will actually cut it and paste it here, like this. And we will have nice liner. So if find by email returns null, we will continue and we will store user details into database. But if it's not null, if we do have a record with provided email address, then we cannot save it to our database and we need to throw an exception. And when we throw a runtime exception, Spring Boot will handle this exception for us and should display a nicely formatted JSON or XML response depending on what accept HTTP header is provided in that HTTP request. So now let's run and try if this code actually works. So I will run my application. Tomcat is up and running, and I will go to a Postman and I will send HTTP request. And here we go. We got an error message, which is a 500 internal server error, but the description of this message says record already exists. So it works. And if I provide a different email address, like test1, for example, it should insert the record into a database without an error message. And it works. Okay, so let's continue.